So, hi everybody. I know I said that I would do this on Twitch, but to be honest, I've got a very bad cold. I cannot be bothered to set it up. And quite honestly, we can do a quick catch up now like this. You can ask your questions and we can do this very quickly. So, as many of you know, the other day, Lecornu resigned and said that he didn't want to, or he physically couldn't be prime minister with the situation as it was in French politics. Too many red lines, nobody collaborating, nobody cooperating, nobody really engaging in the substance and making things work well. To be honest, I agree with him. It was always the biggest concern that we all had. And we all knew that this is really how it was going to go the minute we saw, as you saw in last week's Weekly Dispatch, the budget proposal and the roadmap that Lecornu put forward. And by this, you could basically look at what was proposed by Lecornu, or what was going to be proposed when it eventually leaks, and compare it to Bayrou's proposal that led to his government collapsing. This is simply what ended up happening. And really, we're now in a phase where, to everybody's incomprehension, Emmanuel Macron asked Lecornu to take until Wednesday to do some final last-ditch negotiations to try and figure out if there was a path forward. Now, many people were asking themselves, what's the goal? What's the messaging? What are they actually trying to do here? And to be honest, no one has been able to answer this correctly because the red lines have not changed in any way. You've got a president who's basically signaled through several legislative initiatives and through several political actions that he will be calling new elections, which we now expect to take place sometime in November. I believe it's, if I just check my calendar very quickly, we're expecting it to be the 16th and the 23rd or the 9th and the 16th. I can't quite remember. But on top of this, and these are legislative elections, not presidential. And on top of this, because of the fact that Macron announced this sort of direction in a very vague manner, you now have opposition forces on the extreme. So on the far left, La France Insoumise, on the far right, Marine Le Pen's and Jordan Bardela's Rassemblement National, all trying their hardest to push towards a destitution of the French president. Now, as I mentioned, again, in the Weekly Dispatch, this was very much a tool used as a last-ditch effort to get rid of someone who's engaging in treason or who's physically or mentally or politically incapable in whatever way, shape, or form of conducting themselves as the president of the Republic. Now, we can have our opinions on Emmanuel Macron's, in my view, foolish decision to launch legislative elections after the European elections where we got our asses handed to us. But the reality is he's not acting in a treasonous manner. He's not undermining the French state. And in fact, despite the fact that polls show that people are blaming Emmanuel Macron for the current situation due to the decision to hold these early elections last year, the reality is that they're blaming everybody. The French citizens in the sondage that we're seeing, in the discussions, in the vox pops that we see on France Info, TF1, whatever you call it, or whatever you want to watch, I'll say. And again, sorry guys, I'm recovering from a cold. My brain is operating at like 70%. The reality is that the entire political class has embarrassed itself. They have made a joke out of the French Republic. They've made a joke out of the political situation. And you see this quite often in the discussions that are happening now. It's becoming embarrassing to the point that it's the only way that we're getting out of this is there's another legislative election. And the problem with that is that we're likely ending up in the exact same situation in about 2 months, which doesn't help anybody. And this isn't going to change with or without Macron. This isn't going to change if there's another president. This isn't going to change anytime soon. The simple reality is that the political situation is just too messy. Now, what's happened today? Because today is the ultimate day for Lecornu to try to find some kind of agreement and to try to figure out what's going to be done with the current gridlock. And the goal of today for Lecornu was really to try to put together a budget to try to figure something out. However, despite the fact that he's met with everybody, I think, aside from La France Insoumise who refused, for obvious reasons, and the Rassemblement National, who also refused. Pretty much every single party has met, and there seemed to be an agreement in principle on the fact that all of the parties needed to come together and find some kind of budget and try to resolve the issue. However, the problem is that despite the fact that Lecornu has said that there was a political convergence, that there was a view that a budget needed to be found by the end of 2025 and that it was moving away from the proposal of a dissolution. The issue is that one of the key things that the opposition parties are now demanding, particularly the Parti Socialiste, is that they want to suspend the 2023 pension reform. Now, this is problematic in several ways, mostly because of the fact that a lot of the economic analysis is saying that this is necessary. Otherwise, the French economy and the French debt are going to keep falling out of control. Things are going to keep getting worse. And it's reached a point where the parties have all dug themselves in too deep. Now, even with the fact that the current majority, entre guillemets, the Macronist wing of the Assemblée Nationale had their group chats leaked and is showing that they are actively discussing this issue. Ultimately, they said that, and they've come to an agreement that nothing they do now is going to really change the makeup of what's happening and what's coming down the line. And I think Pierre-Alexandre Anglade, the deputy for the Benelux, so we have deputies from across the world to cover all French people living on this planet, he said it best, pardon me, that the reality is that not giving this up isn't going to solve anything because they're just going to find another issue down the line to actually complain about and find a way to shut this down. And that the opposition parties are going to keep trying to push and push and push because that's just what they're doing for political power and for the political help, basically. And you see this, that it doesn't really make sense that we found ourselves in a position right now where all of the politicians are refusing to compromise in any way, shape, or form. And a lot of the fault on this will fall on Bayrou, who basically called a grand conclave of all of the parties and all the representatives related to their pension issues and the pension reforms, and apparently just refused to negotiate with anybody and said this our way or the highway. And whenever there were alternate proposals made, then he just said, you know what, no, that's not going to happen. This is impossible. A lot of the fault can also be put on the fact that Emmanuel Macron has very likely told Bayrou to leave this alone, because as the leaked discussions showed, the pension reform is really the only major political success, if you can call it that, of the centrist forces and the majority that's been governing since the elections. And on top of this, you also have parties that are very clearly acting in bad faith. So I don't know if you faithful readers of mine, and I love you all to bits, will remember that during the last elections, the far right was pushed for their policy on whether or not they would remove the pension reform as they had been stating over and over again when Macron put it forward. And Jordan Bardella, as slimy as he can be, basically avoided the question at all costs. And the indication ended up being that the RN actually agreed fundamentally with this reform and then was just using it as a wedge issue to it in order to push forward their own political messaging, to become more popular with the average individual. And effectively, the whole goal is just to push this as hard as possible, bring down the government, create enough political instability in order to come into power. And we're seeing this again today, where Marine Le Pen, aside from saying that she's going to censor everything that moves, so she's going to bring down any government that's formed, she's going to do everything she can to just continue the gridlock, continue the problems. He, and I'm quoting, said that she could only welcome a suspension of the pension reform, quote unquote, if it happened. Now, it's clear that she doesn't care. And I think the only party that really genuinely cares about this, in my view, is probably the Parti Socialiste, who have always been against this particular reform and who, admittedly, to their credit, have not been as aggressive and as, let's say, politicized about this topic as they usually could have been, or as La France Insoumise have been. And you can see some aspects of this in that, based on what we heard earlier today, the Raphael Glucksmann, the MEP from the Parti Socialiste, but who runs his own party called Place Publique, who tends to be quite close to the original Emmanuel Macron line of 2017 when it comes to the politics and the more social liberal side of everything, was apparently one of the people who agreed to the fact that this budget could work when they met earlier today and when there were discussions happening yesterday. And a part of this, in my opinion, is the fact that they also do have an understanding of the economic and the financial implications of this retirement reform being cancelled or suspended. And to quote the soon-to-be former, well, technically resigning Minister of the Economy, Roland Lescure, modifying the pension reform according to the French Ministry of the Economy, whatever you believe about this and whether they're biased or not, your opinion is your opinion, will cost hundreds of millions just this year, just next year alone, sorry. And then due to inflation and other economic factors, will cost billions in the 2027. And this is a problematic issue. And I will say that the actual economic analysis of a lot of the pension reform has been quite problematic in general, because with there being so many think tanks across France, all of whom have their own particular political leaning and political connection and what have you, with there being a more political media class than many are used to in a lot of the world, and with the fact that the polarization of politics has become so bad in France, this is a difficult thing to share because the figures keep changing based on the position you have and the position you want to push. And this is it renders the discussions around this very difficult, because it's the same thing that you keep seeing when it comes to, for example, the Zuckman tax that we discussed on Sunday, where in some cases, and particularly from the left, they will say that the Zuckman tax will actually raise somewhere in the region of 15 plus billion euros in revenue for the French state, which sounds nice. The problem is that according to the government figures, it's actually closer to the 5 billion-ish range and not necessarily that high either, because it depends on the various financial situations, how capital moves, how the wealthier individuals in France behave. And I think this has become a really big issue in French politics, in that we simply cannot necessarily find a common agreement in an economic analysis that would actually show the truth and that will be agreed upon everybody. And even if, for example, the French state's economic team publishes a report and says, look, this is this is that, this is this, based on this factor, that factor, whatever, you can rest assured that you will, regardless of what is said and how viable and how correct it is, you will always find the far right and the far left will say, this is a lie, this is wrong, blah, blah, blah. I read this on Twitter, I read that on Blue Sky, blah, 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 blah. Now, one of the big issues that I keep seeing discussed is either the resignation of Emmanuel Macron or his destitution. Now, on one side, the resignation is, I think, the least likely end result of this discussion and the situation in general, because look, I'm a Macronist. I think I'm pretty clear about that. Despite the fact that I'm quite critical of Emmanuel Macron, I'm a social liberal. It's the politics that is linked closest to me in general. And as a European federalist, this is simply just the kind of politics I believe in. Now, Emmanuel Macron simply will not, and I genuinely mean he will not resign, purely because of the fact that he does not want to be the first president in God knows how long. I think maybe the second, maybe, or the third to not complete his mandate because of a situation like either death, illness, or resignation. And even though Edouard Philippe is trying to push him to resign, the simple reality is that the only reason that Edouard Philippe is doing that is because he saw a poll that came out from ELAB that stated that if an election took place at the end of September/early October, he would be the candidate from the center who would be the most likely to go through to the second round. Pardon me. Now, this is a complex issue because it really depends on who is running against him. And it depends on the poll, and it depends on what's going on the right and what's going on in the center. So, if, for example, Edouard Philippe runs as the candidate for Ensemble pour la République, which is the grouping that contains Renaissance, my party, Horizon, Edouard Philippe, Modem, Territoire de Progrès, and other centrist forces, then he's looking like he would win between 15 and 16% of the votes in a first-round presidential election. Now, obviously, the first place would go to Bardella, who would come out with about 35%, I believe. But the interesting thing is what happens on the left. So if Raphaël Glucksmann ends up being the candidate for the Parti Socialiste, he would go to the second round. But this is only in the event that he would be representing a unified left that excludes La France Insoumise. And in this case, then what ends up happening is that not only does Glucksmann go through for the left bloc, but Jean-Luc Mélenchon would go to the second round as well. And I would need to revise my legal background on this, but if you have 3 candidates that pass through to the third round, I believe they all run. But if there is a unified left and everybody's there together, and you've got La France Insoumise all the way to the PS running together, then what ends up happening is that Philippe goes through immediately. No one from the left is going through in that election. And every single time, the left will lose to Philippe. But if Gabriel Attal is running, then Attal loses, and the second round of the election is the 2 left-wing candidates, or however that's resolved in political theory. I really need to check that. I've not seen that in my lifetime, or read about it either, to be honest. And then Jordan Bardella. And a big reason why this is important to bear in mind is that Edouard Philippe is basically doing everything he can to try to push forward and become president of the French Republic. It's a dream he's had since he stopped being prime minister. It's a dream he's had for, I think, close to a decade now, actually. And it would have been 2027 would be a decade from the start of the Macron years and the impact of the centrist bloc coming forward. And this plays quite a bit in the situation. But there's another factor to consider when it comes to all of this as well, is that the longer the situation keeps going forward, and the less power that Philippe has, and the less power that centrists have in general, then the less impact that Philippe will have. And this is very important in French politics, where the president is usually a very personal, it's a populist position. The people have to really believe in the president to really push someone through, or they have to really hate the other guy. and they have to really, the cordon sanitaire and everything, they really have to dislike the other person who runs. We saw this with Chirac versus Le Pen back in the early 2000s, where Le Pen was absolutely stomped. Or, as many people remind, in the last elections, where it was very much an election on the cordon sanitaire to prevent the far right from going forward. Now, another factor in this is also the fact that Retailleau, the now former interior minister, who is the reason why this government has collapsed, because he put up a red line that he didn't want to have another right-wing politician in an important position. And therefore, when he heard that Bruno Le Maire had been made minister for the armies, Retailleau had a tantrum and said, I'm not doing this, I'm out. And currently, Retailleau is polling at around 10%. And his polling numbers are constantly going down. And in my view, he killed his presidential campaign by doing the stupid things he's done recently. And without a government position, Retailleau is very, very, very hard to keep an eye on because he just doesn't do anything. A lot of his rhetoric isn't very different to Eric Ciotti. A lot of his behavior is not that different to the way Bardella behaves, and that they just complain about security issues and then say that, we need more police officers. We need less crime. We need less drugs in the streets. It's very much basic right-wing politics. And then when it comes to actually having important policy proposals, there's nothing really there that's not being said. I mean, for example, lots of his policies when he was interior minister are things that had already been underway or been in discussion for 5 or 6 years by that point, while Darmanin was interior minister, while the Garde des Sceaux, so the justice minister, was doing his work, the variety of justice ministers were doing their work. And so without that position, he cedes the ground to the center-right. So the candidates to his left in Les Républicains, the EPR, and even the PS, who all typically agree on crime issues and the fact that we need more police officers. Just the issue is how we fund them and all this kind of stuff. And so, to come back to the original point I was making, this is why Edouard Philippe joined the chorus of voices who wanted Emmanuel Macron to resign and wanted Emmanuel Macron to quit and leave after announcing that there could be a budget if he left, etc., etc. Now, the other big issue that came up in the last few days is the fact that the opposition forces and the extremists really want to force Emmanuel Macron out of power. Now, I covered the process for this in the Weekly Dispatch. It's basically a vote from one of the houses. It has to be 2/3. Then it has to be authorized by the legal committee. Then it has to go to the next house and be confirmed there. And then it's reviewed by the Constitutional Council. I can't remember the body that handles that. The problem is that the opposition forces keep trying to force this vote through. Obviously screaming scandal in every way. And the reality is that it's not going to happen. It's like there are so many steps and checks and balances to avoid this power being abused, because naturally Charles de Gaulle, being Charles de Gaulle and the man who created the Fifth Republic, because he got sick and tired of parliamentary shenanigans and all this noise, made a system that made it very hard to impeach a president and made a strong presidential republic because of the fact that he wanted a strong presidential republic that was less easily undermined by political gridlock. And the impeachment motion that was tabled, I think it was yesterday or today or something, I can't remember the days, went to the Bureau of the National Assembly and then was rejected with only the left voting in favor, the center voted against, the center-right voted against, and the Rassemblement National abstained. Now, a part of this could be because the RN doesn't feel ready for an election yet. And they may simply not feel ready for an election yet because they're still trying to figure out what the hell their position is going to be. Now, we covered a few weeks back, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago now, that the RN is planning to table an amnesty law if they win a majority, to get rid of the criminal indictment that banned Marine Le Pen from running for president because she's a criminal who embezzled millions of funding with her friends in the Rassemblement National. However, that has been put on the back burner because they realized that the Constitutional Council would shut that down extremely, and I mean extremely quickly. Now, the other aspect of this is that maybe they're hoping that and this is going to be, put in the chat if you don't really know British politics or remember the Brexit period, because I'm going to give an example here and it's a bit new. But there is a style of populist politics where what you basically do is you make as much negative noise as you can. You start screaming bloody murder for as long as you can. You make the noise of being the opposition and saying that you hate everything and that everything's wrong and you dislike everything and na. Because you want to be seen as fighting for the average person's position, you want to be defending the common man from the corrupt elites or from Batman or I don't know, whoever. And then you hope that at all costs, the thing that you've been railing for never actually happens. And the reason I'm mentioning Brexit and British politics, and to be honest, this same thing for Donald Trump. Boris Johnson and Michael Gove were basically supporting Brexit back in 2016, back in 2015, 2016, I think, because of the fact that they wanted to make a run at becoming prime minister, both of them, and heading the Conservative Party. And what ended up happening was that they supported it in the hopes that they would just be able to have been the principal people who stood up against the evil Brusselaires and that they stood up against the bureaucrats and that, they're really salt of the earth people. And then when Brexit won and the referendum result ended up leading to Brexit, they were very, very shocked and they were not happy. And Boris Johnson distinctly said behind the scenes that he made a mistake and he shouldn't have done this. It just stopped him from trying to benefit from this, but etc. And it's the same thing with Donald Trump. Donald Trump, and this is all right-wing populists, again, sorry, I'm recovering from a bad cold, they do this in the hopes that they don't actually have to follow through with anything. Donald Trump was having problems with his ratings, with getting on television, with making money, with being seen as an influential actor, and he was seen as someone whose influence had collapsed. So what Mr. Trump did was he launched a presidential campaign. And he was pushing this weird politics, and this is why his politics was so bizarre and his campaign was mostly a joke, is that he didn't really have a policy background, he didn't really have a political position. His whole campaign was railing against the establishment. They're trying to rob your money, they're trying to steal everything from you, the deep state is going to destroy everything. Pedophiles at Pizza Hut, blah, blah, blah. And at a certain point, and this kind of clicked at one point, and you see this if you go through the old political campaigns and you go through the old debates. At a certain point, the weirdos who agree with this weird right-wing populist rhetoric that Donald Trump was spreading kind of as a joke, mostly just to fill his pockets and get back into the limelight, people started cheering. And his political positions were actively drowning out and beating some of the most experienced politicians that the Republicans had in the US. And you kind of see it in his face at one point where he starts developing this swagger because he's kind of realized he's going to actually make it through and he may actually have a shot at becoming the president. And this is really interesting because when he actually won the election, all of the stories from behind the scenes over at Trump Tower on election night was everybody who had basically found their golden ticket and who had booked their trip out of Dodge and who were going to go back to television and doing all of these kind of jobs after the election campaign realized that, oh shit, we have to do our jobs now. Which is why the Trump campaign and the Trump presidency was so chaotic because nobody had planned for anything. It was a complete mess. And they were basically winging it all the time. Now, this is why Marine Le Pen may be avoiding just bringing down or forcing through a censure motion. It also may just be because she knows it's not going to work. They don't have the numbers. It's not legally binding. There's nothing really of substance there. But this is very important. And this isn't going to stop her from trying to force an election anyway. Now, the reality is she can't run in the legislative election. A party will lose their biggest draw, and the usually safe seat that she has up in Nord-Pas-de-Calais will be slightly in play, but it will still likely hold RN. And it will still allow her to be active in French politics. And we're going to see a repeat of last time, where it's just going to be Marine Le Pen's face on everything. Now, and we had the last elections, it was ridiculous. Like, you would have Marine Le Pen here, you'd have Jordan Bardella here, you would have the whole party tagline here, and just underneath Bardella, you would see the tiny face of the candidate that these people were actually voting for. It was ridiculous. But the reality, and something that a lot of people are forgetting, is that if Marine Le Pen is no longer a deputy, if she no longer has to do her work as a deputy, she can then spend all of her time constantly building up her profile and pushing for the presidential elections anyway. And worst case, she does all the prep work ahead of time. And she then basically hands it all to Bardella. And then Bardella can be, the greatest successor that Le Pen has ever known. He's the one who's defending her legacy. He's going to protect her from the excesses of the state and the legal system, etc., etc. But as mentioned earlier, the issue that they're going to see is that even if they manage to win the presidential elections, the RN is very, very, very unlikely to win the legislative elections, because the polling just doesn't hold. The polling isn't there. And even if they're winning 33, 35, 31%, whatever, in the first round of the legislative elections, they're missing somewhere in the range of 67% of votes across the country to get through. And I'm not sure how far the political discourse that took them through 2024 will go this time. Because French citizens are bored of the drama. They're bored of the constant sclerosis. They're bored of the fact that they seem to keep having to go back and vote over and over and over and over again, because the political class can't handle, excuse my French, they cannot handle their shit. They cannot do their jobs. They're behaving like children. And it's not going to help anybody. In fact, what may end up happening is that we see exactly the same scores as last time, but honestly, just with less votes. Because the abstention, 2022, 24, sorry, the motivator behind that election and the big turnout that we saw was that people were terrified of a far right or a far left candidate coming through. And so people were coming out and voting in droves. To the point that I remember receiving messages constantly to see if I could help out at the voting booths, because they simply didn't have enough people for what they were expecting to come in. And it's very, very messy, because quite frankly, the politicians are playing with fire, and I think that they're actively trying to avoid going to an election, because I think that they know that if there's less turnout, then people are going to be less predictable in their votes. And I think this harms everyone. To the point that we may even see, I don't know, the ecologists, Lutte Ouvrière, so the Workers' Party, and Dominique de Villepin somehow coming out with 20% between them. Like this kind of stuff. There's always a lot of very odd results that come out of these kind of elections. I mean, for example, the Brexit vote. Half the people didn't even turn up to vote because the fact that they figured it was already priced in. Then nobody saw Brexit coming, right? This is how it works. But ultimately, we're going to have to see how this plays out. And just as a final point, and if anybody has any questions, just drop them very quickly because I'll be checking out in 5-10 minutes otherwise. In the most recent news, apparently, after having spent 2, 3, 4, 5 months now saying that the budget coming in would be focused on reducing the budget, or reducing the deficit, sorry. Well, it means the same thing, really. Apparently, Sébastien Lecornu has stated that he's ready to give up on reducing the deficit if it leads to the budget being passed. Now, this is going to come back to what I was saying 20 minutes ago, where, well, I said this on Sunday as well. I've said this to about 5 different news agencies today and yesterday. I'll probably say it another couple of times too. This is probably still not going to move the dial. Because what's going to end up happening is that he's going to say, okay, we don't cut the things that we had cut. So I think there were certain aspects of health, there were certain aspects of social care that had been bloated and had grown a bit too fast, etc., etc. We'll keep all of our increases, but we'll leave everything otherwise as it was this year or last year. And despite the fact that the opposition have all said that the cuts were some of the big issues that needed to be changed, they're still going to refuse to work with Lecornu on this point because he hasn't gotten rid of the retirement reform. Which means that despite the fact that the 40 billion in savings that have been promised over and over and over again, despite the fact that this is going to absolutely tank the French financial debt and credit scores, and despite the fact that this is just going to keep the same problem that we've had for the last 4 or 5 years going, again, the interest rates are going to be insane on this. And despite the fact that the centrists are giving up on one of their main red lines, I'll bet anybody here €5 that the far left refuses and the far right refuses. I'll bet any of you €5. So this was published at 4:54 Euro time. I'm willing to bet within the next 40 minutes, we're going to see a story about how Marine Le Pen she'll censure the budget because reasons. Mélenchon will say that this is a betrayal of the French people. Edouard Philippe will say that he should be president, and if he was president, none of this would happen. It's a very silly situation, and it doesn't left. Okay, thanks for tuning in, guys. Despite the fact that I sound very phlegmy and I sound absolutely heinously horrible. And I'll probably do another of these tomorrow because of the fact that once Lecornu has given his speech at 8 o'clock, we will likely know if there's going to be elections soon or not. And so I will probably do it this time on Twitch, just because it's easier for me to do screen grabs and I can start showing a few more graphs and this kind of thing. So if you guys want to see more of my stuff, and I'm trying to do more stuff visually, vocally, and this kind of thing, you can find me on Twitch under my name. You can find me here on Substack. You can find me on social media. You can find me on Instagram. You can find me on whatever. And if you guys like my stuff, maybe take on a paid subscription, maybe donate via coffee, subscribe to me on Twitch. Giving me more visibility if you like my work is going to help more people like my work. And I like to think that people like my work. So, let's keep the train going. But thank you very much, everybody. and have a lovely evening despite the fact that the Franco-German engine is on fire. But yeah, thank you very much.